Have you heard the term bokeh, either in photography or in painting, and wondered what it is? Or seen paintings with lovely sort of diffused spots of light in the background and think, oh, I like that. That is bokeh. It's out of focus, dots of light. This time of year, I'm making this film in December, you see it in the background of so many Christmas type paintings with sparkly fairy lights. But bokeh isn't just for Christmas, it's for all year round, whether it's the glint of light on water or light through leaves in the spring. And I've come up with 12 different ways of achieving bokeh effect. There you go, there's 12 in there, different techniques, and I want to share those with you. My name's Liz Chatterton. I'm a professional artist based in Berkshire, and every week I bring you a tip, trick or technique that I wish I'd known about ages ago. And this week it's bokeh. Just before we get to painting our bokeh, let's have a quick look at these and see if we can work out some rules for them. And the first thing I think you'll agree on is that they all have soft edges. They may be quite defined, but they are soft edges. They're placed randomly, unless it is a bokeh like this in a cityscape where you can see those are probably car headlights, these are building lights, but generally they're placed randomly. The points of light touch and overlap. They do vary in colour. These are obviously sort of Christmas lights here. In this one, they aren't varied in size because presumably all the lights are roughly the same distance away and same size. And they're lighter than the background, but they do vary in colour and tone. So that was the Christmas bokeh, which we're most familiar with. But let's have a quick look at this. So we've got bokeh as a foreground and here catching the glint on the water. Does this follow the rules that we've just had a look at? Yeah, definitely. They're soft edged. They are very random. They again overlap and touch, and where they overlap they add up, so that's interesting. They do vary in tone and colour. These ones very much vary in size, and again lighter than that background. So I think we've got some good rules there, and this was the cityscape. So yeah, I think those obey all the rules. They're obviously not random here because you don't get random buildings, but say here they're random. So I want to show you lots of different ways of painting bokeh, and you can choose which is your favourite or which is most appropriate to your subject matter. And the first one we're going to do is start with masking. And this is masking fluid, which I'm putting on with just a colour shaper. It's like a little silicone wedge, because if you use your best brush you are going to run into problems because you cannot wash it out of your brush. So I'm putting this latex fluid on, then I'm going to let it dry, and then we'll paint. Now the advantage of this method is that you can paint the background really loose, wet and wet, with no worry about going over the circles. We're going to get absolutely stark white circles on this, but the downside is that the edges are going to be really hard, and we've already seen that the edges of our out of focus points of light are soft, so we're going to have to go back in and soften things when they're dry. And because these will be stark white, we've seen they vary in tone, so maybe we'd use this method for some of the bokeh and use a different method for another. So I'm using watercolour paper, £140 throughout, just so that we can compare all the different methods. Right, our masking fluid is dry. It will still feel tacky, but just make sure it doesn't come off on your fingers, because if it comes off on your fingers, it's going to come off on your brush. If you did get any little drops or bits you don't want, just rub them off, and that's good. And now we can do our background wash. but is sort of in a bit of a rough and ready way because we've got the masking fluid there to protect the circles. So we can be very slapdash with this. Sadly, we've got to wait for that to dry again before we can take the masking fluid off. See whether our masking fluid is dry. So, or I should say the surrounds of it, because again, if it's still damp, when you take your masking fluid off, potentially you'll rip your paper, so do it carefully. And to take masking fluid off, just rub it gently with your finger. And do it gently, just in case anything starts to rip and you end up with a very stark, hard-edged mark. You can also use a little eraser because we want to get rid of the pencil lines that were there. Got rid of the pencil lines, and we've got a few problems here. We've got wonky circles, we've got very harsh edges, and we've got bits of paint that got through the masking fluid. So we need our little short flat brush again. We're going to make sure it's clean, take off the excess, and we can come in here and smooth everything out. And actually, that's not bad because it will take off some of that brightness so that we'll end up with different tones of bokeh. And then let's soften off those edges and take away that harsh edge. Let me unstick that so I can come around here and I can sort out my dodgy circles at the same time. This one's particularly wonky, so again, damp brush, damp clean brush, and let's sort that out. If you do want to say have one, oh I don't know, a bit of blue, because we've got a couple with the sort of violet tint, you can always go back in with very dilute paint and just add a little tint should you wish to, so that you've got a nice variety of tones in your bokeh. Our next method is very similar to the masking method, except this time I've drawn out the circles and I'm just going to paint round them. So I'm going to wet the paper first because that will give me a little bit more painting time and I won't end up with sort of a hard outline. So the upside of this one is, of course, we don't have to wait for masking fluid to dry. Still going to get very hard edges here. I'm going to let them dry and then soften them off afterwards. If you soften the edges while they're still wet, you quite often end up with a little bit of a halo around your bokeh, which you might not want. So I've got leftover paint in my palette here. I've got some blues, which I can just dot in. Oh, a bit of turquoise. Ooh, look at that go. And it will only go into the wet, it won't go into the dry paper. And oh, that's pretty actually. Let's just bung in a bit of pink as well. So just coming round here. I'm going to do it quite dark because then everything will show up more. Don't think I wet round here, so I'll just go around that circle carefully. Say if you work quite fast and you're confident, you don't have to pre-wet the paper. I like mixing all these colours wet in wet because it sort of gives the idea of more going on behind it. This is now dry, again just double checking, and I'm going to rub out those pencil lines because I don't want those showing through. And you can see that I haven't got perfect circles and they are very hard edged, so we need to do something to them to make them look more bokeh like. And again, I'm going to just use that little short flat brush, which I'm cleaning off, definitely want that clean, and drying on my paper towel. I'm then going to come in and basically soften off edges, and at the same time I can make things a little bit more circular if I've been a bit slapdash with it. As you loosen that pigment, there's a danger that it'll go into your white area. Actually, I don't think that particularly matters, because very few bokeh are really bright white, and if they are white and very bright, it's going to be in the centre where the main light is. So actually doing it this way just softens them. And can you see the difference in the feel between that and that? Now if you tried to do this while the background was even a little bit damp, you'd end up with sort of cauliflowers and water blooms starting to form, and it would all get into a right mess. So just be patient. Obviously turn your work round just to make it more comfortable. The other thing that we might want to consider doing at this point, do you remember I said that sometimes you get an overlap? So we might actually want to colour our overlap. And again, just lift some of that with a bit of kitchen towel to make it sort of a little more subtle. They're all a bit too stark white. Of course, we can always go back in with very dilute paint and just take a little bit of the brightness off a couple of them so that we've got some variety. And again, potentially they might be a little bit darker at the outside and paler in the middle, because that's where the brightness is. And you can see how just by doing those couple of little things we can turn our very clunky circles into far more plausible bokeh. So our next method is lifting out, and I'm going to show you 3 different ways of lifting out from a wet surface. So first of all, I'm going to paint our surface, and again I'm just using leftover colours in my palette, but I've tried to select colours that aren't too staining, so they don't sink into the paper too much, I hope. And the danger of lifting out while it's very, very wet is that the colour will just go back in. Let me show you that. So our first method is just using a brush, and I've just got a damp, clean brush, and I lift out, then clean the brush, dry it off again so it's really thirsty, and we can lift out our circle. We definitely get fuzzy edges, but we don't get back to the white of the paper, do we? Now that possibly isn't a problem, because we saw that all our bokeh are of different colours and tones. So just keep drying that brush, cleaning and drying that brush, and we lift out like that. The second way we can lift out is just to use a bit of our kitchen towel and sort of scrunch it in pretty much a circle, and then to lift out with that. It's not a perfect circle, but actually can you see how the water is going back into what we'd lifted out before? So we can just use our kitchen towel to lift out as good a circle as we can. I'm just going to go back into that brushed one and just force it back. Let's see how that goes. Okay, so that's 2 methods of lifting out, and you can see that the kitchen towel actually has lifted more of that colour. And then the third lifting out, get a small coin. Now in the UK our little 5p piece is the smallest. Put it in a bit of kitchen towel, sort of twist it round so that you've got a pretty perfect circle, and you can lift out just like that, so you get a far more accurate circle. But of course we're limited by the size of our coins. Let's do a different one. If you're doing several, you'd need to obviously move it to a clean piece of paper. This is a penny, so that's our next smallest coin. And you're just sort of stamping it out. Now on the blue, it hasn't lifted as much colour, but again, I quite like that. You can see that this with the brush is sort of fuzzier, so it looks more distant. So maybe if I come over here while it's wet, and I can lift out like that, and I think that's pretty effective. It's a good idea to try to use colours that don't really sink into your paper. So non-staining colours are going to lift more easily. But if you want to use staining colours, well, then you just have to live with the fact that you're not going to be able to lift everything. I thought that blue would lift better than the sienna that I've used there, but that just shows I'm wrong. So 3 ways of lifting out. So we've already looked at lifting out when everything was wet. Now let's look at lifting out when everything's dry. So of course, first of all, just as we've done before, we need to paint our surface. Again, this method will work best if the colours that you use are not staining. But if they are, you'll just get some of the colour left behind, and possibly it'll look a bit more subtle, but you won't be able to get back to the real white of the paper. This is now dry, and you can tell because using the back of your hand, it just feels room temperature rather than cold. And let's look at a couple of different ways of lifting out. If you haven't got a circle stencil, then we need to draw around something circular. I'll come back to that circle stencil in a moment. So again, it could be something like a coin. It could be the top of your paint pot, really doesn't matter. And then you need a short flat brush, or one with quite stiff bristles, maybe even a stencil brush. They would be perfect if you've got one. I haven't. It needs to be dampened and then dried off. And you go into your paint with that damp brush and start to loosen the paint. So I'm sort of tickling the surface, then I'm cleaning my brush, going back in again, damp brush, not wet, because if it's wet, you'll find it harder to control. If you want to lift off more paint, use a clean piece of kitchen towel, and you can just anything you've loosened, you can lift away. You do get a nice soft edge that we were after. If you've got one of these stencils, and that cost about £3, I think, just from Amazon. It comes from Artway. You can decide where you want your bokeh and what size you want it. So why don't we do a little overlap there? You need to make sure it's good and flat to the surface. Again, it's a clean, damp brush. If it's wet, the water will seep under the plastic and you'll get wonky edges. So you can use your short flat brush, loosen lots of pigment and pull it away. Might want to do it a few times, just being careful on the edges, depending whether you want perfect circles or not. And then let's have a look at that. There we go. So a stencil is very useful if you're going to do this type of background frequently. The third lifting out of dry is the same with the stencil, but instead of using the short flat brush, we're going to use some magic eraser. And this is a sponge that is actually for household cleaning. You can get it from art shops. It can be ripped to the right size. You dampen it in water, or wet it in water, and then you have to squeeze it till all that water comes out. Again, you don't want the water to go under the stencil. So when it's damp, hold your stencil nice and flat and simply go round with it, and generally you'll find it takes off more of the paint than the brush on its own. So, and then, ooh, I need a clean bit of towel, and that's a tiny bit of towel. You can just pull off loosened paint. Now do go careful, because this is abrasive and you've probably got, oh, I don't know, 3 passes over the paper before you start to pill up the surface. Take that off, and can you see how that's slightly brighter than these? So again, it's quite nice to get different tone ones. Let's do another one over here. So flat down, my magic eraser. Don't want to damage the surface, so let's be a little bit more careful than I was with the first. You've loosened lots of paint. We're just pulling off anything that's loose there. And I've got another lovely point of light. It's the lifting out, and it's quite nice to have, say, those slightly different tones. I've called this method cheating, and you will see why in a moment. But again, I'm just going to prepare that background. Try not to have it too wet for this method, because what you don't want is the paint to whoosh back into the areas that you have created those little out of focus dots of light. And I need to let that soak into the paper and get to a slightly more moist than wet state. And the secret ingredient that we're going to have a go with is dishwasher rinse aid. So I'm popping some in a pot, and I'll use that colour shaper again. It won't harm your brush, but let's see if this works. And I am putting on a little dot of the rinse aid, and it forms beautiful points of light. It has to be a dot to try and get it pretty circular. But isn't that lovely? Now, that is instant bokeh. You could do this with any alcohol, a clear alcohol, so like gin, vodka, old perfume you don't like if it's got a high alcohol content. That one hasn't, that's better. What else could you use? I wonder if you could use hand sanitizer, because we've probably all got some of that lurking around, sadly. And it's high alcohol, so that would be another possibility. Now, the downside of this is that you don't get clear circles. You do get these little feathery marks, but actually, aren't they rather lovely? Once your paper starts to dry, so say this area has dried, you will find that the rinse aid just sits on the surface. It doesn't really move it. So it needs to be wet, but if your paper is too wet, you'll get this beautiful effect, and then it'll go back into the area. The water will just rush in and you'll lose the marks. But if you want some instant bokeh, that is a fantastic way of doing it. That's a great cheat, isn't it? Our next method is going to be adding pastels, so going in for a bit of mixed media. But first of all, I've got to prepare my wet and wet background. That needs to dry thoroughly. If you remember, we said we were going to add some pastel to see what that did. I'm going to use my little stencil on the grounds that I bought it. I want to use it lots, and I've got the tiniest bit of pastel pencil, which I can just fill in one of these circles. Now that's not great, so I might smooth that off with my finger. It's just because it was picking up the slight texture of the surface, but yeah, that's okay then. And obviously I could make it brighter by going over in places if I want to sort of fill in the tooth of the paper. So pastel pencil. You might not have pastel pencils, you might have little pastels like this, a little set or something, so you could use any colour. I'm just using white here so that we can sort of compare. And again, it's harder to do with this square, so I'm going to use my finger. Again, it's picking up some of the texture of the cold pressed surface, but if you smooth it out with your finger, I think just get rid of that dust. Yeah, that's okay. That would be a way of doing it. I then also grabbed, this is an ink tent, so it's a watercolour pencil, and this is going to be interesting because I've never done this before. It didn't occur to me. So I can just colour that if I want. And because it's a watercolour pencil, I should be able to just use clean water and sort of soften some of those marks. Yeah, that's pretty subtle, which is no bad thing because we talked about them being different tones, so that would be a possibility. I managed to find, this is a white charcoal, a Koh-i-Noor white charcoal pencil, and that is a Conte white drawing pencil. So let's have a look at those. Just be careful because that's still wet. This is the white charcoal, very similar to the pastel pencil, but that would certainly work. Just blow away any dust that you get. And let's look at that white Conte pencil. I want to come over here. Is that dry? Yeah, it's dry enough. Again, just smooth it out. I mean, I think the least successful is the white watercolour pencil. That might need to sort of be gone over a bit, but if push comes to shove, you could always do that. So that will be a very quick way of adding bokeh. Now, if you ended up needing to do any watercolour work on top of it, it will move and dissolve the pastel, so do be aware of that. And I think that's pretty effective. If you've got pan pastels, I think those would work brilliantly. Actually, just before we stop with the pastels, let's do a different colour one. I say I did use white, but we've already seen that bokeh can be all different colours. So let's just do a little pink one here, because I happen to have a pink pastel pencil. Definitely better smoothed out. We said we're going to have a go at adding some gouache, or of course you could use white watercolour, Chinese white. You can either do it freehand or you could draw a guide line if you want. So let's have a go at both. There's a guide. Let's do a couple. Again, just draw around a coin if you haven't got a stencil. And I've got some leftover gouache here. I don't want it to be too opaque in any shape or form. So I'm really diluting it down. Let's see how that goes. And then I'm going to carefully colour in that circle. We could lift some of that off just to try and get more of that transparency going on. We could do another one here. If it's more liquid, we won't get the lines so much. My concern with this is that you do get brush marks and it looks very obvious that you've just painted on top. So we'll sort of even some of that out without hopefully disturbing the colour underneath. Let's do a freehand one over here, see whether I can actually paint a circle, which of course just has the advantage of not having the pencil line, which I'll need to rub out after it's fully dry. Oh, I don't want to cover that lovely bloom that I've got going on there, so I might just do another. Just try and smooth out those brush marks. I think that's going to be the big issue with this method. Let's do a bigger one. Is that you're going to, it's going to be obvious that you've painted them on top. But there might be cases when that isn't an issue for you. So I think the secret is not to fiddle, which of course is what I'm doing, and probably not to use your gouache too wet so it disturbs the underlayer. So let's have just a really quick recap. Probably my least favourite is masking, because you have to wait for everything to dry and soften things off. Painting round, again, you have to wait for it to dry and then soften edges. I really like lifting out of dry because you can plan exactly where the circles are and it's very controlled. And I love the lifting out of the wet, and you can see actually by doing all those different lifting out methods that you do start to get more depth. Love the cheating method, always in for a good cheat, so that's great. Adding gouache, they kind of look a bit more like bubbles than they do bokeh, but it might get you out of a hole if you need to. And then adding pastel or pencils, again, it might just be what you need. So I think I wouldn't say that one is better than the other. I would anticipate using a few of them in the same painting to start getting this depth of really soft diffused light and sharper bokeh, so that it really starts to add depth to your paintings.